If you really want to get a handle on the future of the global economy, you've got to understand the Indian consumer. But here's the thing. Looking ahead to 2026, that story is anything but simple. It's this massive, complex, and honestly pretty contradictory picture of explosive growth happening right next to some really intense economic pressure. Okay, so let's dive in and try to make sense of it all.
So, our source material gives us these 15 key predictions for the Indian consumer by 2026, and they cover the whole shebang: e commerce, AI, housing, job security, you name it. Think of this list as our guide. But what's really fascinating is that this isn't just a random list of facts. All 15 of these points actually weave together to tell one single, really powerful story.
And that's the story right there. This is the whole explainer in a nutshell. We're not looking at one unified market. We're looking at a story of sharp bifurcation. On one side, you have this booming, affluent India that's driving all this premium growth. And on the other, you have a mass market India that is feeling a serious, serious squeeze. Let's break down both sides of this tale. All right, first up, let's talk about the consumer boom. The sheer scale and energy here are just undeniable, and it's fundamentally reshaping the country's entire economic landscape. Now, get this, because this is a really crucial insight. A massive 40 to 50% of all new spending growth isn't expected to come from the big metro areas you might think of. No, it's coming from rural India and the smaller Tier 2 and 3 cities. This is a fundamental shift in the country's economic center of gravity. And you know what's driving a huge part of this? The digital explosion. E-commerce is on track to grab up to 16% of all retail sales. And we're not just talking about your standard online shopping here. This is being supercharged by things like quick commerce, getting your groceries in 15 minutes, and social commerce. These things are completely disrupting the old way of doing business. The engine behind all of this is a really powerful digital backbone. By 2026, India's digital and cloud infrastructure is projected to contribute a staggering 8% of the nation's entire GDP. We're talking about an ecosystem that's creating something like 14 million jobs in the process. It's an economic force all on its own. But, and this is a really big but, that boom, as incredible as it is not the whole story. Not even close. Because when you start to look a little closer, all that amazing growth actually reveals a deep structural split in the market. This quote from the source material just nails it. The market is literally being pulled in two totally different directions. The affluent are spending more than ever on premium stuff, while the mass market is having to tighten its belt. This isn't just a gap, it's a chasm. And this leads to this really interesting behavior you see here, sometimes called trading down to trade up. So the mass consumer is cutting costs on the basics, right? They're finding cheaper staples, looking for deals on essentials, so they can afford to splurge on premium products in just a few specific categories that really define their identity and their aspirations, things like a new smartphone or a particular beauty product. Now, this is where it gets kind of weird. Here's the paradox. If you just look at sentiment, India is expected to rank number 2 in the entire world for consumer confidence. People are really optimistic about where the country's economy is headed. But that optimism doesn't always translate into them actually opening up their wallets. And this is what we call the confidence action gap. See, despite that high confidence, the actual intent to spend on non-essential things is falling. So why is that? It's because underneath all that optimism are some very real, very deep economic anxieties. The key takeaway here is that confidence and spending are decoupling. They're no longer telling the same story. So what's actually causing this gap? Let's zoom in on the pressures that the majority of Indian consumers are facing. This is the crucial context you need to understand their cautious behavior. Okay, brace yourself for this number because it is just astonishing. Over a recent 5-year period, real wage growth for many people was 0.01%. I mean, that's basically zero. Incomes are essentially flat, while the cost of living just keeps climbing. This is the absolute heart of the squeeze. And a huge piece of that rising cost, housing. With prices projected to jump another 6 to 8%, the dream of owning a home is getting harder and harder to reach. And this affordability crisis has a ripple effect, right? It forces people to delay other huge purchases, from cars to home appliances. And this anxiety isn't some niche concern. We are talking about a full 60% of households saying they are worried about inflation. It's not just some abstract economic data point. For millions of families, it's a daily stress that directly shapes every single spending decision they make.
And if that wasn't enough, there's a new curveball adding to the uncertainty, a phenomenon called AI's quiet drift. See, generative AI isn't causing these massive headline-grabbing layoffs. Instead, it's quietly decoupling GDP growth from the creation of new white-collar jobs. So the economy grows, but hiring in big sectors like IT starts to slow down. This makes even those secure urban professionals a lot more defensive with their money. So you add it all up, stagnant wages, crazy housing costs, job insecurity, and what do you get? You get a major social trend, delayed adulthood. Young consumers are pushing back all these major life milestones, and that has huge long-term consequences because it slows down growth in all the categories tied to starting a family and setting up a new home. So you have these two completely different narratives happening at the exact same time, a booming market and a squeezed consumer. How on earth do you navigate that? Let's wrap up by looking at the key takeaways for what this all means for the future. The first big shift is all about technology. You can forget about just SEO. The new game in town is Generative Engine Optimization, or GEO. What this means is making sure all of your product information is perfectly structured so that AI chatbots and recommendation engines can find it and promote it. In the near future, if an AI doesn't know you exist, your customers might not either. So what's the bottom line here? The key strategic takeaway is this. A one-size-fits-all approach in India is absolutely doomed to fail. To succeed by 2026, you're going to need a dual operating model. You need one strategy for the affluent consumer focused on premium, aspirational products, and you need a completely different strategy for the mass market, focused on value, affordability, and meeting essential needs. You have to serve both Indias, separately. And all of this leaves us with one final critical question. We know this split, this bifurcation, is the story of today and the near future. But as we look past 2026, will this great Indian divide keep getting wider, creating an even more polarized market? Or will the fruits of all that incredible growth at the top eventually start to lift the whole economy and actually begin to close that gap? Well, that remains the defining question for India's consumer future.